I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. "You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight grades, joined honor societies, and won every coding competition available, but it was never enough. That coldness followed me into adulthood and infected my marriage with my husband Julian. He presented himself as a supportive partner, but slowly revealed his true nature. The real breaking point, the moment that shattered every illusion I had left, did not happen at that brunch. That brunch was just the aftermath. The true awakening happened exactly 2 weeks earlier inside a sterile hospital room. I had just undergone major spinal surgery after a terrifying car accident. I woke up with my entire body feeling heavy and numb, attached to buzzing monitors and medical lines. I could barely open my eyes. But the first sound I heard was not a sigh of relief from my husband. It was my mother-in-law Evelyn screaming into her cell phone. "I do not care about your company policy," she yelled. "These are premium cruise tickets to the Bahamas, and you will refund them right now." "Do you know who my husband is? He is Pastor Calvin, and we do not accept this level of disrespect." I turned my head, wincing. Julian stood at the foot of my hospital bed, scrolling through his phone. He did not ask if I was in pain. Instead, he sighed loudly. "This is unbelievable," Julian muttered. "I told you to take the highway, Charmaine. Now my entire vacation is ruined. I have been looking forward to this trip for 6 months, and you choose this exact week to get into an accident." I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry. "Julian," I whispered. He finally looked at me, but his eyes held zero affection. There was only irritation. "And another thing," he continued. "You did not transfer the $9,000 allowance to my parents' account before you got behind the wheel. The mortgage on the church property is due. How are we supposed to handle our finances when you are being so irresponsible?" I stared at him. I was lying in a hospital bed, freshly sliced open, and my husband was throwing a tantrum over his missed luxury cruise and his parents' monthly handout. The $9,000 he called an allowance was money I generated from my cybersecurity firm. It was supposed to be a temporary donation to help his father's church. But temporary quickly turned into an absolute entitlement. Julian acted like he was the provider while secretly draining my accounts to fund a lifestyle his family could never afford on their own. Evelyn finally hung up her phone and glared at me. "They refused the refund," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "All that money wasted. Charmaine, you have a terrible habit of making everything about yourself. Your father-in-law has been working tirelessly for the congregation, and he desperately needed this rest. But no, you had to be the center of attention again." I lay there, letting their toxic words wash over me. For years I had played the role of the dutiful wife and the obedient daughter-in-law. But watching Evelyn mourn her cruise tickets while I lay broken, and hearing Julian complain about money while I could not even feel my legs, shattered the spell completely. I realized in that exact moment, I was not a wife to Julian. I was an automated teller machine. I was a host to parasites. "Well," Evelyn said, grabbing her expensive purse, "we cannot stay here. Julian let us go. We need to figure out what to do with our ruined week." You are leaving, I asked, my voice scratching against my dry throat. Julian rolled his eyes. Rolled. Do not start with this guilt trip, Charmaine. What exactly am I supposed to do here? I need to decompress. Just text me when you are ready to send the money transfer. He turned around and walked out the door. Evelyn followed close behind him. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me alone. I did not cry. I reached for the call button and pressed it. A nurse entered. I need my cell phone, I said, my voice gaining strength. And I need to hire a private care nurse immediately. As she retrieved my phone, I opened my banking app. With 3 quick taps, I canceled the recurring $9,000 transfer to Pastor Calvin's church fund. Next, I logged into my credit card portal and completely deactivated the supplementary black card I had given Julian. Finally, I sent a text message to my lawyer, Elias. Initiate Protocol B. Lock down all joint assets. Julian is out. I closed my eyes, feeling the first genuine smile stretch across my face. He was about to find out what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. The heavy hospital door had barely been shut for a minute before it swung open again, hitting the wall with a loud thud. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the nurse returning with my water. Instead, it was Trent, my brother-in-law, followed closely by my husband's sister Layla. Trent was Julian's polar opposite in looks, but his exact duplicate in entitlement. A self-proclaimed cryptocurrency visionary who had never actually held a real job. He marched to the side of my bed, his face red with misplaced frustration. He did not ask how my spine was healing. He did not even look at the heart monitor flashing next to my head. Sienna. We have a massive problem, Trent announced, waving his phone in my face. The wire transfer for my angel investment did not clear. You promised me $50,000 for my new blockchain startup by Friday. The developers are threatening to walk away, and my entire project is going to collapse because you could not bother to hit send before you crashed your car. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his words sink in. You are complaining about a delayed handout while I am in a hospital bed. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper but sharp as glass. It is not a handout, Sienna. It is an investment. Trent snapped back defensively, running a hand through his messy hair. We had an agreement. Julian said you had the funds ready to go. You cannot just leave me hanging like this. I have investors waiting. You do not have investors, Trent, I replied flatly. You have me. I am the only person who has ever funded your imaginary companies. Layla stepped out from behind her husband, her arms crossed over her chest. She was wearing a designer coat I had bought her for her birthday last month. Do not speak to my husband like that, Sienna, she said, her tone dripping with condescension. He is trying to build generational wealth for this family. The least you could do is support him instead of being so selfish. You always make everything about you. First, you ruined my parents' luxury vacation with this little stunt, and now you are sabotaging Trent's career. A little stunt. I had 4 broken vertebrae and a titanium rod in my back. But to Layla and Trent, my near-fatal accident was simply an inconvenience to their cash flow. You are right, Layla, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I have been terribly selfish. Trent let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. Great. So just log into your banking app right now and authorize the wire. It takes 2 seconds. Julian is waiting for us down at the valet, and we cannot miss our flight. We are all going to the Bahamas to help Mom and Dad de-stress from all of this trauma. I looked at the two of them. They stood there in their expensive clothes, completely devoid of empathy, waiting for me to bleed myself dry to fund their delusions. They were not family, they were a financial black hole. I will look into the transfer, I said, keeping my face completely blank. Have a good trip. Trent nodded as if my compliance was simply the natural order of the universe. He turned around and grabbed Layla by the hand. See, I told you she would fix it, he muttered to his wife. Layla paused at the door, adjusting her designer sunglasses. Next time, try to be a little more considerate, Sienna. She tossed over her shoulder. Family is everything. You should remember that. They stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy door shut behind them. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet hospital room. I was alone again. But this time, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt like liberation. I looked down at the phone still gripped in my hand. I had already frozen Julian S. cards and cut off the church allowance. Now it was Trent S. turn. I opened the messaging app and found the thread with my accountant. Cancel the pending $50,000 wire transfer to Trent S. account. I typed, my fingers flying across the screen. Flag the account for fraudulent activity and block all future requests from his name. Message sent. Then I opened my company portal. Trent had been using a secure server I provided to host his so-called startup platform. It was a courtesy I extended months ago. With 2 swift taps, I terminated his server access and deleted the backup drives. His entire imaginary company was now offline permanently. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows. The painkillers were starting to wear off, but I did not reach for the call button right away. I just stared at the ceiling and let a cold, dark smile take over my face. The first genuine smile I had earlier was just the beginning. This one was different. This was the smile of a woman who had just realized her own boundless power. For years I had let these people drain my resources because I wanted so desperately to be part of a real family. I had bought their affection with vacations, luxury cars, and blank checks. But the moment the money machine broke down, they threw me out like useless trash. They thought I was just the quiet, supportive wife who would always foot the bill. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. I built cybersecurity fortresses for a living. I knew how to track every single cent, lock down every hidden asset, and destroy a digital life in mere seconds. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a message from my lawyer, Elias. Protocol B is active, he wrote. Joint accounts are frozen. We are ready when you are. I locked my screen and set the phone down on the bedside table. The trap was officially set. Julian, Evelyn, Layla, and Trent were currently on their way to the airport, expecting to board a luxury cruise on my dime. They were about to step up to the first-class check-in counter and hand over a piece of plastic that was now entirely worthless. The door to my room opened again, and the private nurse I had requested walked in. She had a kind face and a gentle demeanor. "How are we doing, sweetie?" she asked, adjusting my blankets. "Do you need anything to make you more comfortable?" I looked at her, and my cold smile remained. "No, thank you," I replied softly. "I am perfectly comfortable. In fact, I think I am going to enjoy the rest of my day." I closed my eyes and pictured the exact moment Julian would try to swipe that card. I pictured the confusion turning into anger and the anger turning into absolute panic. They had left me here to suffer while they chased the sun. Now they were going to find out how freezing the world really was when my wallet was no longer keeping them warm. The dominoes were in motion, and I was not going to stop until every single one of them had fallen flat. The nurse introduced herself as Maria. Unlike my in-laws, she actually read my medical chart before speaking to me. She adjusted my bed carefully, ensuring my spine was perfectly aligned, and administered the pain medication that Julian had deemed too expensive to upgrade. As the warm relief washed over my back, I felt a profound sense of clarity. For the first time in years, my physical pain was being managed, and my emotional drain had just boarded a shuttle to the airport. Maria brought me a cup of ice chips and a fresh hospital gown. "Do you have anyone coming to sit with you today?" she asked gently, noting the empty chairs in the room. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "The trash took itself out this morning." Maria smiled a knowing, professional smile and did not ask any further questions. She dimmed the harsh fluorescent lights and left me to rest. But I was not going to sleep. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before he picked up. "Elias," I said. "Sienna," he answered, his voice crisp and strictly business. "I see you got my text. Protocol B has been fully initiated, the secondary black cards are frozen, the joint checking accounts have been locked down pending a fraud review, and I have officially halted the $9,000 recurring wire to Pastor Calvin's church fund." I took a deep breath. Good. But I need to confirm the structure of that church fund, Elias. Julian and his parents think it is a charitable donation. Tell me the paperwork says otherwise. I could hear Elias typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard. As your wealth manager, I would never let you throw away $9,000 a month without a safety net, he said. 3 years ago, when Julian pressured you into funding his father's new church annex, I structured the disbursements as a commercial business loan. It was issued by a shell corporation that your company controls. The borrower on paper is not the church. It is Trent's limited liability company. And the collateral tied to that loan is the church land itself, along with Evelyn and Calvin's primary residence. A dark laugh escaped my lips, making my ribs ache. Trent signed the paperwork, I asked. He did, Elias confirmed. Julian convinced him to act as the legal guarantor because Julian did not want his own name attached to the debt in case the church went under. Trent thought he was being a savvy businessman. He did not read the fine print. According to the contract, if the monthly payments cease for 60 days, the loan enters default. And since I just stopped the payments, I mused the clock is ticking. Exactly, Elias said. They have no idea they are sitting on a ticking time bomb. But Sienna, I have to ask. Why now? You have let them drain your accounts for years to keep the peace. What changed today? I looked at the empty hospital room. I looked at the spot where Julian had stood complaining about his luxury cruise while I was hooked up to a morphine drip. I realized that keeping the peace meant fighting a war against myself, I told him. I am done fighting for people who would not even give me a glass of water. Lock it all down, Elias. Every penny. I want them to feel exactly what it is like to survive without my money. Consider it done, Elias replied. Get some rest, Sienna. You are going to need your strength for the fallout. We ended the call and I placed the phone on my chest. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander. I thought about the first time I met Julian. He was charming, attentive, and completely captivated by my ambition. He told me he loved how driven I was. It took me years to realize he did not love my drive. He loved the financial safety net my drive provided. He loved that he could play the role of the successful traditional husband, while I quietly funded his entire existence from the shadows. And his family was worse. Pastor Calvin preached about humility and grace every Sunday, while his wife Evelyn demanded designer handbags to keep up appearances with the other church elders. They treated me like an outsider because I worked in tech instead of teaching or nursing. They looked down on me for not being submissive enough. Yet they never hesitated to hold out their hands when the mortgage was due. Well, the Bank of Siena was permanently closed. I opened my company laptop, which Maria had retrieved from my overnight bag. My fingers danced across the keyboard as I accessed my private security dashboard. Through the software I had installed on my own network, I could see the GPS locations of Julian's and Trent's phones. They were moving steadily down the interstate straight toward the international airport. I pulled up the airline terminal database. I watched as their location dots finally arrived at the departure drop-off zone. I imagined them grabbing their expensive luggage, the luggage I paid for, and strolling confidently toward the VIP check-in counter. I imagined Evelyn adjusting her silk scarf, and Julian walking with that arrogant strut of his, fully expecting the world to bow to his premium status. I set a timer on my watch. I knew exactly how long it would take for them to reach the counter, hand over their passports, and present the black credit card for their non-refundable upgrade fees. I closed the laptop and settled into the pillows. For the next 3 hours, I drifted in and out of a peaceful sleep. My spine throbbed, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in a decade. I was no longer a victim trapped in a toxic marriage. I was the architect of their upcoming ruin. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across my hospital bed. The silence of the room was suddenly shattered by a violent, continuous buzzing. I slowly opened my eyes and looked at the bedside table. My phone was vibrating so hard, it was slowly inching its way off the edge of the table. The screen flashed brilliantly in the dim light. I reached over and picked it up. The notification center was completely full. There were desperate text messages from Layla, confused alerts from Evelyn, and a barrage of furious voice notes from Trent. But right in the center of the screen, shining like a beacon of absolute panic, was a single notification that made my cold smile return. 77 missed calls from Julian. I did not tap the notification to listen to his voicemails. I did not care to hear his desperate voice begging for the money he felt entitled to. Instead, I opened a separate encrypted messaging application on my phone. The message was from Derek, a former colleague who now ran the digital security network for the international airport. I had done a massive favor for Derek a few years ago by patching a critical vulnerability in their radar systems. He owed me, and I was officially calling in that debt. The message contained a single secure link. I tapped it, and a high-definition video player loaded on my screen. It was the closed-circuit television feed from the premium first-class check-in lounge. There was no audio, but the crystal-clear footage told a story more beautiful than any movie I had ever seen. I adjusted my hospital bed, leaning forward slightly, as I watched my in-laws strut into the frame. They looked like a parody of wealth. Evelyn was draped in a ridiculous oversized designer coat, holding a luxury handbag that my hard work had paid for. Pastor Calvin walked beside her, with his chest puffed out, wearing a tailored suit, attempting to look like a man of profound importance. Julian led the group, carrying his expensive leather duffel bag, walking with that arrogant, confident stride that used to fool me into thinking he was a natural leader. Trailing behind them were Layla and Trent, looking annoyed that they actually had to walk through an airport like regular people. They bypassed the long, winding line of economy passengers and marched directly up to the empty red-carpeted premium counter. The ticket agent, a young woman with her hair pulled back into a neat bun, offered them a polite, professional smile. Julian leaned against the counter, acting incredibly casual as he handed over their passports and the secondary black credit card I had issued to him. I watched closely, zooming in on the screen. The agent typed something into her computer and then swiped the heavy metal card through the terminal. Even without audio, I could practically hear the harsh beep of the rejection. The agent frowned slightly and looked at her screen. She typed something else and swiped the card a second time. Same result. She politely handed the card back to Julian, explaining the situation. I watched Julian's face contort in absolute confusion. He shook his head aggressively, pointing at the card, as if the piece of plastic had somehow made a mistake. He pulled out his phone, probably trying to check the banking app, only to find that his access had been completely revoked. Evelyn stepped up to the counter next to him, her face twisting into an ugly scowl. She started pointing her finger at the young agent, clearly demanding that she try again or fetch a manager. The agent remained calm, shaking her head and gesturing to the terminal, which was flashing a solid red light. Declined. This was the exact moment Trent decided to insert himself into the situation. He pushed past Layla and slammed his hands down on the counter. His face was turning a bright shade of crimson. He was aggressively leaning over the desk, shouting at the poor agent. Trent was a man who hid his profound failures behind a loud, entitled personality. He needed this luxury vacation to pretend he was a successful crypto investor, and the realization that his free ride was evaporating made him lose whatever little composure he had left. The agent took a step back, looking alarmed by Trent's aggressive posture. She reached under the desk, pressing what I knew was the silent security alarm. Julian was frantically pacing back and forth now, dialing his phone over and over. I knew exactly who he was trying to call because my own phone had been silently rejecting those exact calls for the past hour. Pastor Calvin tried to intervene, putting a hand on Trent's shoulder to calm him down, but Trent violently shoved the pastor's hand away. The illusion of their perfect, respectful Christian family was shattering in real time in the middle of a crowded public space. Layla started yelling too, waving her arms and pointing at the economy passengers who were now stopping to stare at the commotion. Evelyn pulled the classic move of demanding to speak to the highest authority, waving her hands and probably screaming, "Do you know who my husband is?" But the airport staff did not care about the pastor of a local church. Within seconds, 4 armed airport security officers and 2 terminal police officers jogged into the frame. They surrounded my in-laws. The lead officer held up a hand, instructing Trent to step back from the counter. Trent, being the arrogant fool that he was, did not step back. Instead, he aggressively pointed his finger directly into the chest of the police officer. It was the worst mistake he could have possibly made. The officer immediately grabbed Trent's arm, twisting it behind his back. Trent struggled, putting up a pathetic fight. Layla shrieked, grabbing at the officer's uniform, which only prompted a second officer to step in and physically restrain her. Julian completely abandoned his confident posture and threw his hands up in the air, backing away from his family like a coward trying to distance himself from the chaos. Evelyn looked like she was about to faint. She grabbed onto Calvin's arm, gasping for air as the officer sternly ordered the entire group to leave the premises. They were given no choice. The security team formed a tight perimeter around my disgraced family and began force marching them away from the premium lounge. I watched them being escorted through the massive concourse. Trent was still shouting over his shoulder, his face purple with rage. Layla was crying, her makeup running down her face. Julian looked utterly defeated. His head hung low in absolute shame, as hundreds of travelers watched them get tossed out like common criminals. They were physically shoved through the sliding glass exit doors, out onto the concrete pavement of the departure curb. The live feed ended there. I locked my phone and let out a long, satisfied breath. The physical pain in my spine was nothing compared to the overwhelming joy radiating through my chest. I had taken away their money, and without it, they had instantly turned on each other and destroyed their own precious reputation. But the true masterpiece of this entire disaster was yet to come. I opened a popular social media application on my phone and navigated to the trending section. It did not take long to find exactly what I was looking for. During the massive commotion at the check-in counter, several passengers in the economy line had pulled out their smartphones. The internet loves a public meltdown, and my in-laws had provided a spectacular show. Right there at the top of my feed, climbing rapidly in views, was a shaky vertical video entitled Pastor Family Goes Crazy at Airport and Gets Kicked Out. The thumbnail was a perfectly paused frame of Trent screaming and Evelyn looking like a deranged maniac. I pressed play and finally got to hear the audio of their spectacular downfall. The video had already amassed over 50,000 views in less than an hour. The comments section was an absolute bloodbath. People were identifying Pastor Calvin, pointing out the hypocrisy of a supposedly humble church leader throwing a tantrum over a luxury vacation. Others were mocking Trent's pathetic attempt to fight the police officers. Their meticulously crafted facade of grace and dignity was completely burned to the ground for the entire world to witness. I set the phone down and closed my eyes, savoring the beautiful sound of Evelyn's hysterical screeching echoing from the small speaker. The first domino had officially crushed them. The hospital room was completely silent again. I watched the video loop one more time, watching my supposedly dignified in-laws get physically pushed out of the automatic sliding doors of the departure terminal. The screen on my phone went dark for exactly 2 seconds before it lit up again. It was him, call number 78. This time I decided to answer. I swiped the green button and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, frantic breathing on the other end of the line. Sienna Julian screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. "What did you do? What the hell did you do to my cards? We were just escorted out of the airport like common thugs. My father was practically shoved to the ground. Trent is in handcuffs in a holding room because of you. Unlock the accounts right now." I adjusted my pillow with my free hand, staring blankly at the sterile white wall of my hospital room. "I did not do anything to your cards, Julian," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I did something to my cards. I simply removed the authorized users who forgot how to act like family." "You are sick!" Julian spat, his breathing ragged as if he was pacing on the sidewalk. "You are a sick, twisted woman. You planned this. You waited until we were at the counter in front of everyone to humiliate my family. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to my father's reputation? We are pillars of the community Sienna. We are a respectable black family, and you just turned us into a public spectacle. I let out a slow, soft laugh that made my ribs ache. A respectable family, I echoed, tasting the absolute absurdity of the words. Let us talk about respectability, Julian. Is it respectable to leave your wife in a hospital bed with a fractured spine so you can go drink margaritas on a cruise ship? Is it respectable that your mother cares more about a non-refundable ticket than her daughter-in-law's life? Do not bring my mother into this, Julian yelled. This is about you being a disobedient, disrespectful wife. You think you can control me with your money. You think you can embarrass the son of a pastor. I swear to God, Sienna, if you do not fix this right now, I will go to the church board. I will tell the entire congregation that you have lost your mind. I will tell them you are financially abusing us and that you are an unstable, rebellious woman who refuses to submit to her husband. You will be a pariah. I will ruin your name in this city. His threats hung in the air, pathetic and desperate. I took a deep breath, letting the cool hospital air fill my lungs. You are going to ruin my name, Julian, I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. Let me explain reality to you, since you have been living in a fantasy world for the last 5 years. You do not have a name without me. He tried to interrupt, but I spoke over him, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. That tailored suit you are wearing right now while you stand on the curb, I paid for it. The luxury duffel bag you packed your vacation clothes in, my credit card bought it. That imported sports car you drove to the airport, the lease is in my company name. You walk around this city pretending to be a self-made man, a pillar of the community as you call it. But you are nothing more than a parasite wearing expensive clothes. Shut up, Julian hissed, but his voice was shaking. I will not shut up. I continued, my words striking him with surgical precision. Even your father's precious church is standing on my foundation. The building fund, the renovations, the choir robes, all of it came from the tech company you love to mock behind my back. You want to go to the church board and tell them I am abusive. Be my guest, Julian. I highly encourage it, because the second you do, I will stand in front of that very same congregation and show them the bank statements. I will show them how your family has been draining my accounts to fund your fake luxury lifestyle. We will see who the pariah is when they realize their beloved pastor is a fraud and his son is a gold digger, is a gold. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of the airport traffic faded away as the weight of my words finally crushed his fragile ego. He had always relied on my silence. He had always assumed I was too polite, too focused on keeping the peace to ever expose his shameful secret. He was wrong. Sienna, please, Julian said, his voice suddenly dropping its aggressive edge. The fake bravado was completely gone, replaced by the whiny tone of a man who realized he was completely cornered. You cannot do this to us. We do not have any cash on us. My bank account is overdrawn. We cannot even pay for a cab back to the house. You have to open the card just for today. Let us just get a hotel and we can talk about this like adults tomorrow. You are an adult, Julian, I replied coldly. Figure it out. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button ending the call. Then I immediately blocked his number. I blocked Evelyn's number. I blocked Pastor Calvin and Layla too. I placed the phone gently on the table next to my bed and closed my eyes. The feeling of severing those ties was more intoxicating than any pain medication the doctors could have prescribed. I was free. But a rat cornered in an alley does not just lay down and accept its fate. It bites. Julian was currently standing on the curb of an international airport with his hysterical mother, his humiliated father, and no access to a single dime. They could not go on their cruise, they could not rent a car, they could not even buy a cup of coffee in the terminal. The reality of their absolute poverty was staring them right in the face, And desperation breeds stupidity. They needed cash fast to bail Trent out of airport jail and to save face. Since my digital walls were completely impenetrable, they decided to target the only thing they thought they still had physical access to: my home. The sprawling, smart estate that I purchased before we were even married. They assumed I was trapped in a hospital bed miles away, heavily medicated and completely helpless. They assumed my house was empty and waiting to be picked clean of my designer watches, my jewelry, and the emergency cash I kept in my home office. It was a pathetic criminal act born out of sheer desperation. They thought they were sneaking into an empty house. They had no idea they were walking directly into a digital trap I had designed myself. I opened the primary security application on my tablet. My sprawling estate, situated on a private 2-acre lot in the suburbs, was heavily fortified. It was not just a house, it was a living, breathing prototype for my cybersecurity firm's physical defense systems. Every door, every window, and every floorboard was wired into a central artificial intelligence hub that I controlled directly from my personal devices. I watched the perimeter cameras as a cheap yellow taxi pulled up to the heavy iron gates at the end of my driveway. They could not even afford an executive car service anymore. Trent and Layla stepped out of the cab. They looked incredibly out of place. Trent was still wearing his expensive tailored jacket, but it was wrinkled and stained with sweat from his temper tantrum at the airport. Layla had her arms crossed, shivering slightly in the cool afternoon breeze. They looked nervously up and down the quiet street, checking to make sure my wealthy neighbors were not watching them. Trent walked confidently up to the security keypad mounted on the stone pillar. He punched in the 4-digit emergency code I had given Julian years ago. The heavy iron gates clicked and slowly swung open. They thought they were so incredibly clever. They thought the old access code still worked because I had simply forgotten to change it. But I never forget anything. I had reprogrammed the entire system the exact moment Elias initiated Protocol B. I intentionally left that specific code active as a honeypot. In the cybersecurity world, a honeypot is a trap designed to lure unauthorized users inside, so their intrusion can be fully documented and their methods exposed. They hurried up the long, sweeping driveway, keeping their heads down. Layla was carrying an oversized canvas tote bag, her eyes darting around frantically. She was probably planning to fill it to the brim with my vintage watches, the designer sunglasses I collected, and the diamond tennis bracelets Julian had bought me, using my own money to pretend he was a generous husband. They reached the massive mahogany front door. Trent reached into his pocket and pulled out a spare physical key he must have secretly copied from Julian's keychain. He slid it into the lock and the deadbolt turned with a heavy clunk. They pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer of my home. The moment they crossed the threshold, the system quietly sprang to life. I watched from the high-definition cameras positioned perfectly in the corners of the ceiling. The artificial intelligence registered their thermal signatures and facial structures, instantly matching them against a database of unauthorized individuals. A small green icon flashed on my tablet screen indicating that the primary targets were fully inside the containment zone. They did not bother going to the kitchen or the living room. They did not care to look for cash in the study. They headed straight up the grand floating staircase, making a beeline directly for the master suite. Layla was practically jogging, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Trent followed closely behind her, muttering under his breath about how much money they could get for my limited edition Rolex at the luxury pawn shop downtown. They pushed open the double doors to my bedroom and made their way straight to my massive custom walk-in closet. Layla immediately started pulling my expensive designer bags off the top shelves, tossing them carelessly onto the hardwood floor. She was treating my hard-earned possessions like garbage, rummaging through them to find the most valuable pieces. Trent went straight to the back of the closet toward the built-in wall safe, hidden behind a large full-length mirror. He aggressively pushed the mirror aside and stared at the digital keypad. He cracked his knuckles and started punching in numbers, trying my birthday, our wedding anniversary, and Julian's birthday. Every single attempt was met with a harsh red error light and a low warning beep. Trent grew increasingly frustrated, hitting the keypad with his closed fist. "Open up, you piece of junk," he grumbled, his face turning red again. Layla was too busy stuffing a pair of diamond chandelier earrings she found on my vanity into her canvas tote bag to care about his struggles. "Come on, Trent," she urged, her voice trembling with a mix of greed and nervous energy. "We need to grab what we can and get out of here before the cleaning lady shows up. Let us just take the company laptops and the expensive artwork out in the hallway. We can sell it all online." They were nothing but common scavengers picking at the bones of the life I had built. It was time to end the show. I tapped the master override button on my tablet screen, holding it down for 3 seconds. Instantly, the heavy steel reinforced security shutters rolled down over every single window in the house. The loud mechanical grinding noise echoed through the empty rooms like thunder. The thick, solid mahogany doors throughout the estate slammed shut simultaneously. The heavy electronic deadbolts engaged with a sharp, echoing click, locking every possible exit. On my screen, Trent and Layla completely froze in terror. The ambient lighting in the closet turned off, plunging them into total darkness for a brief, agonizing second before the harsh red emergency lighting flickered to life, bathing the room in an eerie crimson glow. Trent spun around and rushed back to the bedroom door. He grabbed the brass handle and pulled with all of his might. It did not move an inch. The magnetic locking mechanism held it firmly in place with thousands of pounds of force. "What did you do?" Layla screamed, dropping the canvas bag onto the floor. Diamond earrings spilled out, scattering across the hardwood. "I did not do anything," Trent yelled back, kicking the solid wood door in absolute panic. "The house just locked itself down. We are trapped in here." He ran over to the bedroom windows, frantically trying to pry the heavy metal security shutters open with his bare hands, but it was completely useless. My company designed those exact shutters to withstand a Category 5 hurricane and forced entry from armed intruders. A failed crypto bro throwing a tantrum stood zero chance against them. I pressed the microphone icon on my tablet, allowing my voice to travel through the secure, encrypted network. It blasted out of the high-fidelity surround sound speakers mounted invisibly in the ceiling of the master bedroom. "I hope you found what you were looking for, Layla," I said, my voice echoing off the walls. I kept my tone perfectly calm, flat, and terrifyingly steady. Trent and Layla jumped, practically leaping out of their skin. They looked wildly around the red-lit room, searching for the source of the disembodied voice. Sienna Layla stammered, her eyes wide with sheer terror as she finally stared up at the flashing camera lens tucked in the corner of the ceiling. "You are supposed to be in the hospital." "I am in the hospital," I replied, watching them cower together on my high-definition screen. "But my house is perfectly capable of defending itself against rodents. Did you really think you could break into a cybersecurity expert's home and just walk out with a bag full of stolen jewelry?" Trent tried to act tough, puffing out his chest and glaring up at the camera. "We did not break in, you crazy woman," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "We used the gate code and the front door key. Julian told us to come get his personal things. You cannot lock us in here. This is kidnapping." "That is a fascinating legal theory, Trent," I said smoothly. "But the system logged your unauthorized entry code as a breach. The cameras recorded you attempting to crack my personal safe, and the highly sensitive weight sensors on the floor are currently documenting the stolen jewelry Layla just dropped out of her bag. That is felony burglary." Layla started to cry loudly, dropping to her knees in the middle of the closet. "Please, Sienna," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "We are family. We were just desperate. Julian said it was fine to come here. Please do not do this to us." I leaned back into my hospital pillows, staring at the two parasites trapped in my digital cage. I felt absolutely zero pity for either of them. I pressed the final command button on my interface, dispatching the local authorities directly to the property with a Priority 1 alert. "The police have been notified," I announced, my voice filling the room with absolute finality. "The police will be here in 3 minutes. Enjoy your new vacation in jail." I watched the high-definition feed as the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated my driveway. The officers breached the house using the emergency override code I provided them over the phone. Trent and Layla were escorted out in handcuffs, their faces pale and streaked with tears. I saved the video files and sent them directly to Elias. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, but I knew my in-laws were not going to surrender quietly. They were desperate, and desperate people always pivot to the one arena where they still hold absolute power. For Julian and his parents, that arena was the church. 2 days passed. I was finally discharged from the hospital and transported back to my secure home by a private medical transport team. Maria, my private nurse, settled me into the guest suite on the ground floor, since I could not manage the grand staircase. The silence of the house was peaceful. The broken locks had been replaced, and the security system was running perfectly. But I knew exactly what was happening across town. It was Sunday morning, and Sunday meant Pastor Calvin and Evelyn were holding court in front of their congregation. I did not have hidden cameras inside the church sanctuary, but I did not need them. A loyal friend from the congregation, a woman named Brenda, who had always seen right through Evelyn's fake smiles, had her phone resting quietly on her lap during the emergency elder board meeting that afternoon. She streamed the live audio directly to me. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, as the voices of my abusers filled the quiet room. Evelyn took the floor first. She did not yell or act entitled like she did at the airport check-in counter. She played her absolute best role, the weeping, heartbroken matriarch. She sobbed softly into a lace handkerchief, telling the board of elders about the terrible, tragic car accident that had nearly taken her beloved daughter-in-law. She painted a vivid picture of absolute family devotion, claiming they had instantly canceled their highly anticipated family trip just to rush to my hospital bedside. She said they had maintained a constant vigil, praying for my recovery. Then came the lie. A lie so massive and calculated, it made my blood run cold. Evelyn choked back fake tears and announced that the accident had caused severe brain trauma. She claimed the doctors had pulled the family aside and warned them about sudden personality changes and aggressive paranoia. According to Evelyn, my brain injury had made me completely delusional. She told the room full of respected community leaders that I had suddenly turned against my own family without any provocation. She claimed I was hallucinating threats, and most importantly, that I had maliciously locked my devoted husband out of all his bank accounts in a fit of brain-damaged hysteria. Listening to her twist, the narrative was sickening, but also brilliant in its wickedness. She was laying the groundwork to completely invalidate my autonomy. Julian stepped up to the microphone next. He sounded exhausted, playing the part of the weary, faithful husband to absolute perfection. He asked the congregation for their prayers, his voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. He talked about how much he loved me and how terrified he was for my declining mental state. He completely omitted the fact that Trent and Layla were currently sitting in a county jail cell awaiting a bail hearing for felony burglary. Instead, he claimed I was becoming a danger to myself. He told the elders that my massive cybersecurity company was at risk of collapsing because my traumatized brain could no longer process basic reality. He said I was firing loyal employees and canceling vital charitable donations, including the monthly support I provided to the church. He framed my financial boundaries not as a consequence of his greed, but as a tragic symptom of a broken mind. The elder board was composed of older men who implicitly trusted Pastor Calvin. They were conservative men who already believed a husband should be the ultimate head of the household. Hearing that the wife was not only withholding funds but was also clinically insane gave them all the justification they needed to step in. They murmured in sympathetic agreement, their deep voices echoing through the sanctuary. They saw Julian as a noble martyr suffering under the burden of a sick and rebellious wife. One of the senior elders, a wealthy local businessman named Deacon Washington, stood up and addressed the room. He spoke with deep authority, declaring that it was the church's absolute duty to intervene and protect their pastor's family from this tragic mental decline. He proposed that the church provide their best legal resources to help Julian petition the state courts. He said Julian needed to move quickly before I could do any more damage to the family assets. They were not just offering prayers, they were organizing a hostile takeover. Deacon Washington suggested they hire a forensic psychiatrist to testify on Julian's behalf. The rest of the board loudly agreed, offering their personal lawyers and their political connections to fast-track the legal process. I listened to the chorus of agreements ringing out through the phone speaker. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I was not afraid. I was disgusted. These men were supposed to be spiritual leaders, but they were eagerly plotting to strip a woman of her hard-earned empire based entirely on the tears of a manipulative mother-in-law. They wanted to reduce me to a helpless ward of the state simply because I stopped writing their checks. I ended the audio stream and immediately called Elias. He answered on the first ring. I told him exactly what was discussed at the emergency meeting. I told him they were coming for a medical power of attorney and that they had the full backing of the church's legal network. Elias let out a sharp, dry laugh that made me feel instantly grounded. He told me they were playing right into our hands. By claiming I was mentally incompetent, they were preparing to file legal documents that required strict medical evidence. Evidence they simply did not have. "Let them try," Elias said, his voice brimming with cold confidence. "The harder they push, the faster they will fall into the trap." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the setting sun. Julian thought he was so smart, rallying his father's congregation to fight his battles. He thought he could use the weight of the church board to crush my independence and seize my wealth. He had successfully manipulated his community into believing his pathetic victim narrative. The church board had officially agreed to help Julian take over my finances. The very next morning the trap was sprung. I was sitting in the sunroom drinking a cup of herbal tea when the heavy iron gates at the end of my driveway buzzed. Maria was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. My personal assistant, David, had arrived an hour earlier to help me sort through some corporate files. I watched the security monitor as 3 black luxury sedans pulled up to the gate. I recognized the lead car instantly. It was Deacon Washington's town car, followed closely by a vehicle belonging to my father-in-law. David walked into the sunroom holding his tablet. "Sienna," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Julian is at the gate. He has Pastor Calvin Evelyn and about half a dozen men from the church board with him. There is also a man carrying a legal briefcase. Do you want me to call the police and have them removed for trespassing?" I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "No, David," I replied calmly. "Let them in. And please set up the portable laser projector in the main living room. Point it right at the large blank wall above the fireplace." David nodded, understanding immediately that I had a plan. He tapped the screen to open the gates. I adjusted the brace around my torso and slowly made my way to the living room, taking a seat in the large leather armchair situated directly across from the sofa. A few minutes later, the front door opened. Julian walked in first, looking completely exhausted and playing his role of the deeply burdened husband to absolute perfection. Behind him was his father, Pastor Calvin, looking stern and righteous. Evelyn followed closely, clutching her Bible as if it were a physical shield. Then came Deacon Washington and 3 other senior members of the church elder board. Finally, a sleazy-looking man in a cheap gray suit walked in, gripping a leather briefcase. They flooded my living room, filling the space with their imposing presence. Julian stepped forward, his face etched with fake sorrow. "Sienna, my love," he said, his voice dripping with forced empathy. "We are so worried about you. You have not been yourself since the accident." I did not offer him a seat. I just stared at him, letting the silence stretch out until it became deeply uncomfortable. The men shifted awkwardly on their feet. Pastor Calvin cleared his throat and stepped forward, standing beside his son. "Sienna, daughter," he began, using that deep theatrical preaching voice he reserved for Sunday mornings. "We come to you today not in anger but in deep Christian love. Your mind has suffered a terrible shock. The trauma of the accident has clouded your judgment and led you to make irrational, destructive decisions against your own family. The Lord commands us to protect the vulnerable, and right now, you are profoundly vulnerable. I kept my expression completely blank. I am perfectly fine, Calvin. I said, my voice steady and cold. But I appreciate your uninvited concern. Now why are there 7 men standing in my house? The man in the gray suit stepped forward, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. Mrs. Brooks, he said slickly, my name is Attorney Miller representing your husband. Given your recent erratic behavior, including locking your family out of their homes and baselessly cutting off their financial lifelines, we have prepared a medical power of attorney. This document will temporarily transfer control of your assets, your company, and your medical decisions to Julian until you have been properly evaluated by a state-appointed psychiatrist. Julian knelt next to my chair, looking up at me with fake puppy dog eyes. Sienna, please, he whispered, trying to sound gentle. Just sign it. It is for your own good. I promise I will take care of everything while you rest and heal your brain. I am your husband. I am supposed to lead this family. Do not fight us on this. The board is here to witness the signature and offer their spiritual support. Evelyn chimed in, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. We just want our sweet Sienna back, she wailed softly, playing to the crowd. Deacon Washington crossed his arms, looking down at me with heavy patriarchal judgment. A wise woman knows when to submit to her husband's guidance, he rumbled, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet room. Julian is a good man, Sienna. He has suffered greatly from your recent delusions. The church stands firmly behind him. If you refuse to sign these papers voluntarily, we will have no choice but to take this to a judge tomorrow morning and have you declared legally incompetent. We have the resources to drag this out in court for years. Deacon Washington stepped even closer, his massive frame attempting to cast a shadow over me. He added, his voice dropping an octave. You will lose your company, you will lose your house, and you will lose your dignity in the public eye. The media will love a story about a wealthy tech executive who lost her mind after a tragic accident. Do you really want that kind of scandal attached to your name? Your clients would abandon you overnight. We are offering you a quiet, graceful exit. Evelyn nodded furiously, adjusting her expensive silk scarf. It is the Christian thing to do, Sienna. Submit to your husband and let us heal this family. Julian reached out, attempting to place his hand on my knee. I recoiled slightly, pulling my leg back just enough so he grasped empty air. His jaw tightened, displaying a brief flash of the real Julian, the angry, entitled boy who hated being denied. But he quickly recovered his mask of sorrow. I looked at the cheap lawyer Miller. He stood there with a smug, satisfied grin, confident that his intimidation tactics were working perfectly. He tapped a cheap plastic pen against the power of attorney document, waiting for me to surrender. They had perfectly coordinated this ambush. They brought the church leaders to shame me into submission. They brought the lawyer to terrify me with legal jargon. They brought Julian to play the loving victim. They thought a woman sitting alone in a back brace, recovering from major surgery, would simply break down in tears and hand over the keys to her empire. They expected me to scream, to cry, to argue with them, to prove exactly how hysterical and unhinged they claimed I was. But I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not even look at the stack of papers Attorney Miller had placed on the coffee table in front of me. I looked past them toward the back of the room where my assistant David was quietly standing beside a small, sleek electronic device resting on a side table. David, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick, tense air of the living room. Is the connection secure? Yes, Sienna, David replied, tapping his tablet. I slowly turned my gaze back to Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor. His fake expression of sorrow faltered for a brief second, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He looked at his father, then back at me. You want to talk about my irrational decisions? I asked softly, leaning forward in my chair. You want to talk about financial abuse and moral decay? You brought your entire church board into my home to declare me legally incompetent because I stopped giving you $9,000 a month. Deacon Washington frowned, stepping forward. Sienna, this is exactly the paranoid aggression we are talking about. I raised a single hand, silencing the powerful man with a simple gesture. I am not paranoid, Deacon, I stated clearly. I am a cybersecurity engineer. My entire career is built on tracking anomalies, uncovering hidden truths, and securing vulnerable data. When I suspected my husband was an anomaly, I applied my professional skills to my personal life. I looked directly at Julian, whose face was suddenly turning the color of ash. David, I commanded, turn on the projector. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright rectangular glow against the painted brick above my fireplace. David tapped his tablet and the first document appeared in crisp, high definition. It was a standard bank statement, but the logo at the top belonged to an offshore financial institution. I watched the men in the room squint, trying to make sense of the rows of numbers and dates. Let us begin with the charitable donations, I said, leaning back in my chair. For the past 3 years, I have authorized a monthly wire transfer of $9,000. Julian told me this money was strictly for the church building fund and community outreach programs. He said it was his duty as a pastor's son to uplift his community. I nodded to David, and the screen changed, displaying a flowchart. But as you can see, the money never went to the church bank account. It was routed directly into a limited liability company registered under Trent's name. And from there, the funds were immediately split into 2 very distinct streams. Julian was staring at the wall, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man watching his own execution in slow motion. Pastor Calvin stepped closer to the projection, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Evelyn let out a nervous little gasp, clutching her Bible tighter against her chest. David, pull up Stream A, I instructed. The screen shifted again, displaying a long list of transaction records. Hundreds of individual line items filled the wall. They were not invoices for church repairs or receipts for soup kitchens. They were deposits made to international sports betting websites and offshore online casinos. Trent is a man with very expensive hobbies, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. Over the past 36 months, exactly 60% of my church donations were used to cover Trent's massive gambling debts. He lost thousands betting on professional basketball games and horse races, while Julian covered his tracks. Julian signed off on the transfers, knowing exactly where the money was going. Deacon Washington took a heavy step forward, his eyes locked on the projected bank statements. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his face. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint buzz of the projector cooling fan. The numbers did not lie. The routing numbers, the account, names, the timestamps, everything was meticulously documented and impossible to refute. That is a lie, Julian blurted out, his voice high-pitched and frantic. She doctored those documents. She hacked into the bank and changed the names. Nobody in the room even looked at him. They were entirely focused on the undeniable truth painted across my wall. Now let us look at Stream B, I said, ignoring Julian's pathetic outburst entirely. David, the second folder, please. The betting records vanished, replaced by credit card statements from high-end luxury boutiques in Beverly Hills and Paris. There were receipts for exclusive spa retreats, 5-star hotel stays, and astronomical restaurant bills. Evelyn claims I am financially abusive. I continued staring directly into my mother-in-law's panicked eyes. She claims she canceled her luxury vacation to pray for my health. But these statements tell a very different story. 30% of the monthly charity fund was funneled into a private debit card held exclusively by Evelyn. Over the last year alone, she used church funds to purchase 2 authentic Birkin bags, custom designer shoes, and weekly champagne brunches at the country club. Pastor Calvin turned slowly to look at his wife. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Evelyn's jaw trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The righteous matriarch facade had completely dissolved, leaving behind a greedy, terrified woman caught red-handed. "You used the building fund," Calvin whispered, his voice thick with absolute horror. "You told me the donations were sitting in a high-yield savings account, waiting for the contractor bids." Evelyn reached out to touch his arm, but he violently yanked it away. "Do not touch me," he hissed, his deep, preaching voice reduced to a disgusted growl. I watched the devastating realization wash over the church elders. These men had dedicated their lives to their congregation. They had trusted Calvin and his family implicitly. They had walked into my home ready to strip me of my rights because they believed I was a cruel, unhinged woman attacking a pious family. Now they were staring at the cold, hard proof that their beloved pastor's family was operating a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, using my hard-earned money to fund their gambling addictions and luxury shopping sprees. Attorney Miller, the sleazy lawyer Julian had brought along, quietly snapped his briefcase shut. He did not say a single word. He just backed away from the group, turned around, and let himself out the front door. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he was not about to go down with it. Deacon Washington slowly took off his reading glasses and tucked them back into his pocket. He turned to face Julian, his expression hardening into pure, absolute disgust. "You brought us into this woman's home," Washington said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "You lied to us. You used the name of the Lord to cover your own greed, and you tried to weaponize this board to steal her company. You are a disgrace to your faith and a disgrace to your community." Julian fell to his knees, his hands trembling. "Deacon, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You do not understand. She is trying to frame us. We needed that money." "Save your breath," Washington snapped, cutting him off completely. "The Elder Board will be convening an emergency session tonight. Pastor Calvin, you are officially suspended from all pastoral duties, effective immediately, pending a full independent audit of the church finances. If we find that even 1 penny of congregation money is missing, we will involve the authorities." Calvin looked like he had been physically struck. He staggered backward, leaning against the wall for support. His entire legacy, his entire life was crumbling right in front of his eyes. "Come on, brothers," Washington said, turning toward the front door. "We are done here." The elders did not look back. They walked out in a single file line, their heavy footsteps echoing through the foyer. The front door clicked shut, leaving an incredibly heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Julian was still on the floor, weeping openly. Evelyn was staring blankly at the wall where the projector was still displaying the receipt for her $20,000 handbag. The family that had walked in acting like royalty was now publicly shamed, utterly destroyed, and completely at my mercy. I did not say another word to them. I simply gestured to David, who politely but firmly showed my weeping husband and his shell-shocked parents to the front door. I watched from the window as they piled into Pastor Calvin's sedan. The ride back to their mortgaged home must have been suffocating. The church was conducting a full audit, which meant Evelyn's credit cards would be frozen and Calvin's salary suspended. They had nothing left but their own toxic company. But rats are most dangerous when they are cornered. Over the next few days, Julian did not call to apologize. He did not ask how my spine was healing. Instead, he turned to the only person whose moral compass was as broken as his own: Trent. Trent and Layla had managed to post bail using the last of Layla's savings. They were facing serious felony charges, but Trent's arrogance remained untouched by reality. He convinced Julian that they were not defeated. He convinced Julian that my tactical strike on their finances was actually a massive legal vulnerability. I knew exactly what they were planning because Julian is entirely predictable. When his ego is bruised, he looks for a way to assert dominance without doing any actual work. According to Elias, my lawyer Trent had connected Julian with a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney downtown, a man who specialized in extracting maximum wealth from high-net-worth spouses by dragging their personal lives through the public mud. 2 weeks after the disastrous ambush, I was finally cleared by my doctor to walk without my back brace. I was standing in my home office looking over corporate contracts when the doorbell rang. Maria answered it and walked into my office holding a thick manila envelope. The process server did not wait to confirm my identity. He just shoved the envelope into Maria's hands and ran back to his car. I opened the envelope and pulled out the crisp legal documents. It was a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. Julian had filed for divorce. I sat down at my desk and read through the demands. They were absolutely astronomical. Julian was not just asking for alimony to maintain the luxurious lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. He was coming for the crown jewel itself. Under our state's marital property laws, any business value created during the course of the marriage is considered joint property, regardless of whose name is on the corporate charter. His aggressive lawyer claimed that, because my cybersecurity firm tripled in valuation during our marriage, he was legally entitled to exactly 50% of that growth. They demanded half my shares, half my physical assets, and a forced liquidation of my commercial real estate to pay his settlement. It was a dirty, vicious play, orchestrated entirely by Trent. Trent knew that a messy public divorce would tank my company's stock valuation and scare off my high-profile government clients. They were betting that I would panic. They were banking on the assumption that I would rather write them a massive multi-million-dollar settlement check than risk dragging my company through a prolonged, ugly court battle. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Elias. "Did you get the package?" Elias asked, his voice tight with professional anger. "I just received the digital copy from opposing counsel. They are asking for half the company Sienna. They want to force a buyout." I read the filing. I replied calmly, turning the page of the legal document. "Trent's fingerprints are all over this. It is a shakedown." Elias sighed heavily. "It is a shakedown, but it is legally sound. Julian has a legitimate claim to the appreciation of your assets during the marriage. If we go before a judge, we might lose a significant portion of your portfolio. They are playing dirty." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the ridiculous list of demands. He wanted the house. He wanted the cars. He even requested that I continue paying the legal fees for Trent and Layla's burglary defense because they were incurred during our marriage. The sheer audacity of his greed was almost impressive. Julian called me exactly 10 minutes later. He wanted to make sure I had received his little declaration of war. I answered the phone, putting it on speaker so David could record the conversation for our files. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Sienna," he replied, sounding incredibly smug. "I assume you have read the paperwork by now. I told you I was the head of this family. You thought you could just cut me off and humiliate my parents without any consequences. Well, actions have consequences. You are suing for half of a company you do not even know how to spell," I noted dryly. "I am taking what is mine," Julian shot back. "Trent connected me with the best sharks in the city. They reviewed your corporate structure and told me I have a rock-solid case. You can fight me in court and watch your clients run, or we can settle this quietly. Give me my half of the equity, sign the house over to me, and reinstate the church funding. If you do that, I will call off the lawyers." He really thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought he had outsmarted me using the very legal system I relied on to protect my assets. He was relying on the standard rules of marital law to secure a massive payday without lifting a single finger. "I will review the settlement offer with my legal team, Julian," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "You do that," he gloated. "And Sienna, do not take too long. My lawyers are very expensive, and you will be footing the bill for them eventually anyway." He hung up the phone, feeling like a complete victor. Trent and Julian sat in their rented apartment, convinced their dirty legal play had checkmated me. They thought my silence was the sound of submission. They mistakenly believed they had the legal upper hand. They had no idea they had just walked willingly into the final, most devastating phase of my trap. Elias sat across from me in my home office, reviewing the ridiculous divorce petition Julian had served. I poured myself another cup of herbal tea, completely unfazed by the multi-million-dollar threat sitting on my desk. Elias was practically grinding his teeth in frustration, explaining how state laws could theoretically force a settlement. But I knew Julian better than anyone. Julian did not have the stamina for a prolonged legal battle. A real corporate divorce would require forensic accounting depositions and years of court dates. Julian wanted fast cash and immediate gratification. He wanted to look like a winner without doing the actual work. I told Elias to wait. I told him not to file an immediate response. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Julian was going to blink first. Exactly 3 days later, my prediction came true. The aggressive shark lawyer Julian hired suddenly went completely silent. No motions were filed with the court clerk. No tedious discovery requests were sent to my legal team. Instead, I received a direct email from Trent. Trent, the failed crypto investor who is currently out on bail for breaking into my home, had decided to play the role of legal mastermind. He sent an email with an attachment titled, "Compromise Agreement, Final Draft." He copied Julian on the message stating that families should settle things privately without feeding the expensive lawyers. It was so transparent, it was almost pathetic. Trent had convinced Julian that the divorce petition was the perfect leverage to force me into a dark corner. Now they were swooping in with a supposed olive branch, hoping I was terrified enough of losing my business equity to sign whatever messy document they put in front of me. They wanted me to think this was my only escape route from a public scandal. I printed the document out on thick paper and laid it out on my large oak desk. Elias drove over immediately, dropping his other appointments to review it with me. The document was titled Post-Nuptial Asset Division Agreement. It was an absolute mess of a legal contract. Trent had clearly pieced it together using free legal templates he found on random internet forums. The formatting was wildly inconsistent, swapping between different fonts, and the legal jargon was entirely misused. But the core demands were crystal clear and incredibly greedy. The agreement stipulated that Julian would formally withdraw his divorce petition and permanently waive any and all claims to the equity valuation and future profits of my cybersecurity firm. In exchange, I had to transfer the deed of my primary estate directly into Julian's name. I also had to surrender 2 commercial properties I owned downtown and, most importantly, reinstate the $9,000 monthly church fund indefinitely. Elias read through the pages, his professional demeanor completely breaking down into genuine amusement. He let out a sharp laugh, tossing the final page onto the wooden desk. "Sienna, this is the sloppiest piece of legal fiction I have ever seen," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Trent thinks he discovered a genius loophole, but he fundamentally misunderstands basic contract law. This clause right here, where Julian waives his rights to your corporate assets, is absolutely ironclad. Trent accidentally used the exact boilerplate language required by the state to completely sever marital property claims. He basically copied and pasted the strongest possible waiver against his own brother-in-law. But the clauses demanding your real estate and the church funding are completely contradictory to the existing liens on those exact same properties. I leaned over the desk, tracing the freshly printed words with my index finger. Trent thought he was executing a brilliant extortion plot. He figured I would happily trade a few houses and a monthly stipend to protect the multi-million-dollar valuation of my life work. He told Julian to demand the real estate because he knew Julian wanted to live like a king without having to work for it. And he demanded the church fund because Trent secretly needed that money to pay off his mounting offshore gambling debts and his upcoming criminal defense attorney fees. They designed this document to strip me of my physical wealth while letting me keep my digital empire. They thought it was the perfect compromise. A clean break where they walked away rich and I walked away with my company intact and my reputation secure. But they made one fatal, catastrophic error in their greedy little plot. When Trent drafted the clause regarding the church fund, he completely forgot how I had originally structured that massive amount of money. He forgot, or perhaps his arrogant brain never truly understood, that the $9,000 a month was not a charitable donation. It was the repayment of a commercial business loan tied directly to his own limited liability company. And he completely forgot that the collateral for that massive corporate loan was the church property itself and Pastor Calvin's primary residence. By drafting a post-nuptial agreement that severed our joint marital assets, Julian was voluntarily giving up his legal right to claim my company profits to pay off his family's existing debts. Elias looked at me, his eyes wide with dawn realization as he pieced the entire puzzle together. If Julian signs this post-nuptial agreement, he officially separates his financial liabilities from your corporate assets, Elias whispered, tapping the paper. Which means when the commercial loan defaults because you officially stopped making the payments, Julian cannot touch a single cent of your company money to save his parents' house. He is legally walling himself off from the only cash source that could bail his family out of total ruin. I smiled a slow, cold smile that reached all the way to my eyes. Exactly, Elias, I replied, leaning back in my chair. They are demanding the very properties that are currently acting as collateral for their own hidden debt. They think this piece of paper is a weapon that will force me to fund their luxurious lifestyle forever. They think they have cornered me with the threat of a messy, brutal divorce trial. They are sitting in their cramped rented apartment right now, drinking cheap beer and congratulating themselves on outsmarting a wealthy tech executive. They truly believe they are in complete control of the narrative and that I am shaking in fear. They have absolutely no idea they are playing checkers while I am playing chess. 2 days later, Julian finally made his grand appearance. I was sitting in the formal living room when the security gate buzzed. David checked the monitor and informed me that Julian had arrived alone in a rented car. I told David to let him through the gate and escort him directly to the living room. I made sure to sit on the large velvet sofa wearing a simple gray sweater, looking as small and defeated as possible. I needed Julian to believe his intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. I needed him to think I was utterly exhausted by the threat of a public divorce. The heavy mahogany doors opened and Julian walked in. He looked completely different from the arrogant man who had stormed into my hospital room demanding his allowance. He had clearly spent hours practicing this specific look. He wore a slightly wrinkled dress shirt, and his hair was uncharacteristically messy. He had even managed to produce a look of deep sorrow in his eyes. He stopped a few feet away from the sofa, holding a leather folder against his chest. Sienna, he whispered, his voice cracking perfectly on the second syllable. I did not say a word. I just looked down at my hands, playing the part of the broken wife. Julian took another step forward, and then slowly, dramatically dropped to his knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. He let out a long, trembling sigh and bowed his head. I am so sorry, Sienna, he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed emotion. I am so sorry for everything that has happened over the last few weeks. I let my anger and my pride get the better of me. The lawyers got into my head and made me think we had to destroy each other. But I do not want to destroy you. I love you. You are my wife, and I just want my family back. I watched him perform. It was truly a masterful display of manipulation. If I had not already seen the offshore gambling receipts and the luxury shopping statements, I might have actually believed him. I might have reached out and touched his face like I used to do whenever he pretended to be stressed about his non-existent career. But now I could see every single lie hiding behind his watery eyes. He slowly unzipped the leather folder and pulled out a stack of paper. It was the exact same post-nuptial agreement Trent had emailed me earlier. He placed it gently on the glass coffee table, sliding it toward me. I fired the divorce lawyer this morning. Julian lied smoothly, wiping a fake tear from his cheek. I told him I could not go through with a brutal trial. I could not stand the thought of dragging your brilliant company through the mud. You built that company from the ground up, Sienna, and I have no right to take half of it away from you. Trent and I sat down last night and we drafted this compromise instead. It is a post-nuptial agreement. If you sign this, I will officially drop the divorce petition today. We can separate our finances cleanly and quietly. I stared at the papers on the table. You want to drop the divorce? I asked, keeping my voice small and uncertain. Yes, he said eagerly, nodding his head. I am waiving all my rights to your corporate equity. Every single share remains yours forever. I just want to make sure my parents are taken care of. You know how important the church is to my father. So the agreement just asks for the 2 downtown commercial properties, the deed to this house, and the reinstatement of the monthly church donation. That is all. It is a tiny fraction of what a judge would award me in a trial, but I am willing to walk away with less because I care about you. I want us to heal. He was staring at me with wide, innocent eyes, acting like he was making a massive sacrificial compromise. He wanted me to believe he was surrendering millions of dollars out of the goodness of his heart. He completely ignored the fact that he was demanding my primary residence and thousands of dollars in guaranteed monthly income without having to work a single day for the rest of his life. He wanted to be a wealthy landlord and a funded prince at my expense. I slowly reached out and picked up the document. The paper felt heavy in my hands. Julian held his breath, watching my every move. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He thought he had perfectly executed the ultimate trap. He thought I was reading a document that would secure his financial independence forever. He had no idea he had just handed me the legal sword I would use to sever his head. I flipped to the second page, my eyes scanning the horribly formatted paragraphs Trent had cobbled together. I read the specific clause where Julian explicitly waived his legal right to any marital assets related to my business. I read the section where he demanded the church fund. I let the silence stretch out in the massive living room. The only sound was the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Julian remained on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He was waiting for me to argue. He was waiting for me to cry about losing the house. He was fully prepared to launch into another monologue about how a court battle would ruin my reputation and bankrupt my company. He had a whole script memorized just in case I resisted. But I did not resist. I just kept reading, letting the unbearable tension fill the space between us. The silence grew heavier and heavier, pressing down on him. I could see a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. I could see the slight twitch in his jaw. The tense silence stretched into an eternity as I read the final page. I reached the bottom of the final page of the document. The silence in the room was so absolute I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing. Julian was still kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the stack of paper in my hands. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for me to scream at him for daring to ask for my house and my money. Elias stepped out from the shadows of the adjoining study. He had been standing there the entire time, listening to Julian's pathetic performance. He walked slowly into the living room, his expression dark and severe. "Sienna, you cannot possibly sign this document," Elias said, his voice ringing with authoritative panic. "It is a complete surrender of your primary physical assets. This contract is predatory, and I strongly advise against putting your name on that dotted line. We can take this to court and crush him. Do not let him manipulate you into giving away your home." Julian scrambled to his feet, his fake sorrow instantly vanishing. He turned to face Elias, his face flushing with defensive anger. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. "Back off, Elias." Julian spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is a private matter between a husband and his wife. You are just a paid employee trying to rack up billable hours. Sienna and I are trying to heal our family. She knows that a drawn-out court battle will destroy her company stock. I am doing her a favor by settling this quietly." Elias shook his head, stepping closer to the coffee table. "You are extorting her, Julian. You are using the threat of a messy divorce to steal her real estate. Sienna, I beg you to listen to reason. If you sign this paper, you are handing him the keys to your house and securing a monthly income for his parents that they absolutely do not deserve. Let me file the countersuit." Julian looked panicked. He turned back to me, his eyes wide and desperate. "Sienna, do not listen to him," Julian pleaded, taking a step closer to the sofa. "He just wants to bleed us dry in court. Think about your reputation. Think about the company. If we go to trial, everything becomes public record. Your clients will leave. Your investors will pull out. Just sign the paper and we can both walk away clean. I will drop the divorce today. I sat perfectly still, letting the two men argue. Elias was playing his part beautifully. His fake outrage was the exact catalyst Julian needed to believe this document was a massive victory. If my lawyer hated it, Julian would naturally assume it was brilliant. Trent's ridiculous legal strategy relied entirely on my supposed fear of a public scandal. They thought my tech company was my ultimate weakness. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting on the edge of the coffee table. The polished metal felt cool against my fingers. Elias let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Sienna, please," he said one last time, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Do not do this." I looked up at Elias and offered him a small, reassuring smile. "It is fine, Elias," I said, my voice soft and deliberately defeated. "I am just so tired of fighting. I just want this nightmare to be over." Julian let out a massive breath of relief. His entire body relaxed and a sickening grin began to spread across his face. He watched with hungry, eager eyes as I pulled the cap off the fountain pen. I placed the final page of the document flat on the glass table. I did not hesitate. I pressed the gold nib against the thick paper and signed my name with smooth, elegant strokes. I dated the bottom of the page and initialed the required clauses exactly where Trent had placed the clumsy highlighting. The second the ink touched the paper, the energy in the room shifted completely. Julian practically lunged forward to grab the document. He snatched the papers off the table, clutching them to his chest like a winning lottery ticket. He looked down at my signature, and a loud, triumphant laugh erupted from his throat. The weeping, repentant husband vanished entirely. He stood up straight, his chest puffed out, and looked down at me with absolute contempt. "You always were too emotional to make hard business decisions." "Sienna," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You let your fear control you. I cannot believe you actually signed it. You just gave me exactly what I wanted." I placed the cap back on the fountain pen and set it down on the table. "You promised to drop the divorce, Julian," I reminded him, keeping my voice quiet and submissive. "Oh, I will drop it," he laughed, slipping the document into his leather folder. "I got the house, I got the downtown properties. And my parents get their monthly allowance reinstated indefinitely. I do not need to drag you to court anymore. I already won. You keep your little computer company, and I get to live my life exactly how I want." Elias stood completely silent, his arms crossed over his chest. He was watching Julian celebrate with a look of pure clinical fascination. Julian turned toward the door, walking with that same arrogant strut he had displayed at the airport. He paused at the entryway and looked back at me over his shoulder. "You have 30 days to vacate my house, Sienna," Julian stated coldly. "I will have my lawyer send over the official eviction notice tomorrow. Do not leave a mess when you pack your things. My parents will be moving in by the end of the month." He turned around and walked out of the living room. A few seconds later, the heavy mahogany front door slammed shut, echoing through the quiet house. Through the large front window, I watched him practically skip down the driveway to his rental car. He was typing frantically on his phone, probably texting Trent to celebrate their brilliant victory. He got into the car and sped out of the gate, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. I remained seated on the velvet sofa. The tense, submissive posture I had maintained for the last 20 minutes instantly melted away. I leaned back into the cushions and let out a long, genuine laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had just watched her enemy voluntarily lock himself inside a burning building. Elias uncrossed his arms and walked over to the sofa, sitting down in the armchair opposite me. He let out a long breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "He really thought he outsmarted you," Elias said, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "He had no idea what he just signed." I turned to look at my lawyer, the cold, calculating smile returning to my lips. "He just legally waived his spousal protection," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "He separated his assets from my company completely and forever. There is nothing standing between his family and the bank now." Elias opened his briefcase and pulled out his secure tablet. The commercial loan is officially 60 days past due. As of this morning, Elias confirmed, tapping the screen. The grace period has expired. The debt on the church property and his parents' house is now in default. I stood up from the sofa, feeling the strength return to my legs. The pain in my spine was completely gone, replaced by the thrilling rush of total victory. They wanted my house so badly, they forgot they had already mortgaged their own. Trigger the final phase. Elias, I commanded, looking out the window at the empty driveway. Let the bank take everything. Let us show them what a real eviction looks like. It took exactly 5 days for Julian to convince the church board that he had saved his family from financial ruin. According to Brenda, who called me every single evening to provide updates, Julian had marched into the emergency elder meeting, waving my signed post-nuptial agreement like a flag of victory. He told the board that I had finally come to my senses and agreed to formally transfer the deeds of my properties to him to compensate for my supposed mental breakdown. He promised them the church building fund would not only be fully replenished but doubled. The elders, greedy and eager to avoid a massive public scandal, swallowed his lies completely. They officially reinstated Pastor Calvin and called off the forensic audit. To celebrate their miraculous legal triumph, my in-laws decided to throw a massive barbecue on the expansive back lawn of the church property. They did not just throw a simple family gathering. They hosted an extravagant, lavish event to publicly display their restored wealth and status. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the weather was perfectly clear. I sat in the back of an unmarked black luxury SUV parked discreetly across the street from the church grounds. Elias was sitting next to me, holding a thick stack of legal documents and a hot cup of black coffee. The tinted windows of our vehicle offered a perfect, unobstructed view of their ridiculous, premature celebration. They had rented massive white event tents and hired a professional catering company. I could see waiters walking around carrying silver trays of expensive appetizers. A live jazz band was set up on a temporary wooden stage, playing upbeat music that echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The smell of slow-roasted brisket and expensive cigars drifted through the air. I watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars as Julian held court near the massive outdoor grill. He was wearing a crisp white polo shirt, holding a glass of amber whiskey, laughing loudly with the same church elders who had nearly excommunicated his father a week ago. He looked incredibly proud of himself. He genuinely believed he was the architect of the greatest financial heist in the history of his family. Pastor Calvin was back in his element, shaking hands and patting people on the back, wearing a smug smile. Evelyn was sitting at a VIP table specifically set up under a shaded canopy. She was wearing a brand-new designer summer dress, and her infamous designer bag was prominently displayed on the table right next to her plate for everyone to admire. She was holding court with the other pastors' wives, pretending that the humiliating incident at the airport had simply never happened. She was loudly boasting about her upcoming plans to redecorate my home once I was properly evicted. Even Trent and Layla were there, acting as if they were untouchable royalty. Trent was out on bail, waiting for his felony burglary trial, but he strutted around the party like he owned the entire city. He had a cigar clamped between his teeth and was aggressively flirting with one of the young catering waitresses. Layla was wearing a ridiculous oversized sun hat and sipping a colorful cocktail, completely ignoring the fact that she was inches away from serving hard prison time. They were both living in a profound state of delusion, powered by Julian's false promises of endless wealth. They were spending money they absolutely did not have. Julian had probably taken out another massive line of credit, using my signed post-nuptial agreement as collateral. He was borrowing against a future that was never going to arrive. He was funding this extravagant barbecue to buy back the respect of the church board and cement his position as the new wealthy patriarch of the family. Elias checked his silver wristwatch and let out a low, satisfied chuckle. The grace period for the commercial loan expired exactly 48 hours ago, he murmured, his eyes fixed on the party across the street. The bank issued the final default notice to Trent's limited liability company yesterday afternoon. Since Trent ignored the certified letters, and Julian legally severed his marital right to use your corporate funds, To pay the debt, the bank executed the immediate acceleration clause. They do not play games with commercial defaults, Sienna. I lowered my binoculars and looked at Elias. The property belongs to the bank now, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Elias nodded, tapping the thick manila folder on his lap. The church land and Pastor Calvin's primary residence were officially foreclosed upon this morning. The bank successfully petitioned the local magistrate for an immediate writ of possession due to the high risk of property damage. They consider Trent a massive liability because of his pending felony charges, and they know Julian has a history of erratic behavior. They moved with unprecedented speed to secure their assets. I turned my attention back to the party. Julian was currently standing on the wooden stage holding a microphone. The jazz band had stopped playing and the massive crowd of church members was clapping respectfully. He was giving a speech about the power of faith and the strength of a family that sticks together through adversity. He painted himself as a devoted, loving husband who had recently endured terrible trials due to his wife's unfortunate mental decline. He told the crowd that the Lord had rewarded his patience with an abundance of wealth and property. The absolute hypocrisy made my stomach turn, but the feeling was quickly replaced by a wave of cold, thrilling anticipation. "He thinks he won," I whispered, watching Julian raise his whiskey glass in a grand toast to his parents. "He won a front-row seat to his own destruction," Elias replied flatly. Just as the crowd erupted into applause, a loud mechanical siren pierced the air. It was not a brief chirp, but a continuous wailing sound that immediately drowned out the cheers of the congregation. The guests turned around, their smiles fading into looks of total confusion. Mothers instinctively pulled their children closer. The men stood up from their tables, craning their necks to see the source of the disturbance. I watched as a heavy white police cruiser turned off the main road and pulled directly onto the manicured grass of the church lawn, crushing a row of expensive floral arrangements. It did not stop. It drove right up toward the white event tents, parking aggressively on the walkway. A second police cruiser followed closely behind it, its red and blue lights flashing brilliantly in the afternoon sun. Then came a third cruiser blocking the catering vans. And finally, a sleek black luxury sedan with the official logo of the state's largest commercial bank printed discreetly on the side door pulled into the driveway, sealing off the only exit. Julian froze on the stage, dropping the microphone. The sharp screech of audio feedback echoed violently through the large speakers, causing the guests to cover their ears. The heavy doors of the police cruisers swung open simultaneously. 6 uniformed officers stepped out, resting their hands casually on their duty belts. The party completely died. The jazz band members slowly lowered their brass instruments. Evelyn stood up from her VIP table, her face instantly draining of all color as she recognized the seriousness of the situation. Trent dropped his expensive cigar onto the grass, looking like he was ready to bolt over the back fence. The man in the black sedan stepped out wearing a sharp charcoal suit and holding a thick metal clipboard. He did not look like a guest. He looked like the grim reaper of the financial world. He adjusted his tie and walked directly toward Julian. The premature celebration was officially over. Elias and I stepped out of the black luxury vehicle at the exact same time. The heavy doors closed behind us with a solid thud that seemed to echo across the silent lawn. We walked side by side up the concrete driveway toward the massive white event tents. The crowd of church members naturally parted for us, stepping back onto the grass with wide eyes. They had just been clapping for my supposedly broken mental state, and now I was walking toward them looking like a corporate executioner in a tailored black suit. My spine was perfectly straight and my head was held high. The bank representative, a stern-looking man named Mr. Vance, turned to acknowledge our approach. He gave Elias a brief professional nod before turning his attention back to my husband. Julian was still standing, frozen on the wooden stage, the microphone lying dead at his feet. Pastor Calvin and Evelyn had rushed over from their VIP table, standing defensively near the barbecue grill. Trent was hovering in the background, looking like a cornered rat frantically searching for an escape route. Layla was standing next to him, her face completely pale. I walked directly up to the center table where Evelyn had proudly displayed her expensive designer bag. I did not say a word at first. I simply raised my right hand holding the thick manila folder Elias had given me. I let it drop flat onto the table right next to Evelyn's plate of slow-roasted brisket. The heavy slap of the paper hitting the wood made her flinch violently. "What are you doing here, Sienna?" Julian finally managed to ask, his voice shaky and hollow. "You have no right to be here. This is private church property. I am calling the police to have you removed for trespassing right now." He gestured wildly toward the 6 police officers standing near the catering vans, but the officers did not move an inch. They just stood there resting their hands on their duty belts, watching him with flat, unamused expressions. "Actually, Mr. Brooks," Mr. Vance interjected, his voice projecting clearly across the tense, silent crowd. "The police are here at my direct request. I am a senior asset recovery agent for the State Commercial Bank. We are here to execute a finalized writ of possession for this entire parcel of land, including the church building itself and the primary residence located at 421 Elm Street." Pastor Calvin let out a loud, sputtering gasp. His hand flew to his chest as if he had just been physically struck. "What on earth are you talking about?" Calvin demanded, his deep voice shaking with absolute indignation. "This is the house of the Lord. We own this land outright. There is no mortgage on the church property. You have absolutely no legal jurisdiction here." I stepped forward, leaning slightly against the wooden table. I looked directly into Calvin's panicked eyes. "You are right, Calvin," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying effortlessly across the lawn. "There is no traditional residential mortgage on this property, but there is a massive commercial lien." Julian climbed down from the stage, marching toward me with his fists clenched. "What lies are you spinning now, Sienna?" he growled, his face turning an angry shade of red. "We just settled everything. You signed the post-nuptial agreement. You gave me the house. You promised to reinstate the $9,000 monthly church donation. We are completely done with you." I offered him a slow, cold smile. "I did sign the agreement, Julian," I replied, keeping my tone terrifyingly even. "And I did promise to reinstate the monthly payment. But you never bothered to ask what that payment actually was. You assumed it was a charitable donation. You assumed it was a free allowance for your family to live like royalty. You assumed I was just bleeding cash to buy your affection." Evelyn crossed her arms, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "It was a donation," she snapped, her voice shrill and defensive. "You gave it to the church fund. We used it for the community." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the thick folder on the table. "Open the file, Julian," I instructed, ignoring his mother entirely. Julian hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the grim-looking bank representative. He slowly reached out and opened the folder. The first page was a copy of the original financial contract from 3 years ago. It had Trent's signature clearly printed at the bottom right, next to Julian's signature as the verifying witness. "Read the title of the document," Julian first commanded. He stared at the paper, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His arrogant facade was crumbling into dust right in front of my eyes. "Since my husband seems to have lost his voice, I will explain it to the congregation," I announced, turning to face the crowd of shocked church members. 3 years ago, Pastor Calvin wanted to build a massive new annex. He did not have the funds. Julian begged me to pay for it, but I do not hand out free money to people who refuse to work. So I structured the $9,000 a month as a specialized commercial business loan. I turned my gaze toward Trent, who was now trying to slowly back away into the crowd. "I routed the loan through Trent's limited liability company," I continued, pointing directly at my terrified brother-in-law. "Trent signed as the primary borrower. And in order to secure a loan of that massive size, the bank required substantial collateral." Pastor Calvin swayed on his feet, gripping the edge of the table to keep from falling over. "What did you use for collateral?" he whispered, his voice breaking into a quiet sob. "Julian knew exactly what the collateral was," I said, shifting my eyes back to my husband. He signed the witness affidavit. The collateral was the deed to this church and the deed to your private family home. The congregation erupted into a loud chorus of gasps and angry murmurs. The elders who had just been drinking whiskey with Julian were now staring at him with absolute murderous intent. Deacon Washington stepped forward, his face dark with fury. Julian had lied to them again. He had secretly gambled their entire place of worship on a commercial loan to fund his brother-in-law's fake businesses. "But we have been making the payments," Julian shouted desperately, tapping the paper. "You have been paying it every single month, Sienna. The loan is current. You cannot foreclose on a current loan." I looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "I was paying it, Julian," I corrected him. "Until you decided to abandon me in a hospital room with a broken spine. Do you remember what you told me before you left for the airport? You told me you needed to decompress, and that I should text you when the transfer was complete. Well, I never sent the transfer. I froze the accounts instead. That was exactly 60 days ago." Mr. Vance, the bank agent, stepped forward, pulling a legally stamped document from his clipboard. "According to the strict terms of this commercial agreement, any lapse in payment exceeding 60 days results in an automatic default," he explained loudly. "There is no grace period left. The debt has been permanently accelerated. Because Sienna stopped the payments 2 months ago, the loan defaulted. The bank has foreclosed the properties." The crowd of church members erupted into absolute chaos. People were shouting and pointing at my in-laws. Julian stared at Mr. Vance, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. "You cannot do this, Sienna," Julian stammered, stepping closer to the table. "We are married. Whatever debt there is, my name is attached to it, and you are legally my wife. Your company is a marital asset. You have millions of dollars sitting in your corporate accounts. The bank can just take the money from your firm to cover the default." Elias stepped forward, standing between me and my husband. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp copy of the exact document Julian had celebrated signing just a few days ago. "Actually, Julian, you made sure that is entirely impossible," Elias said, his voice projecting clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. "Do you recognize this document? It is the post-nuptial agreement your brother-in-law drafted. You were so incredibly eager to take Sienna's physical real estate that you eagerly signed the waiver clause without understanding the legal consequences of your own greed." Julian looked at the paper, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted back and forth as he tried to process the reality of what Elias was saying. "Let me read it for you," Elias continued, holding the paper up for the entire congregation to see. "The husband, Julian Brooks, hereby irrevocably waives any and all current and future claims to the corporate assets, equity, and financial holdings of the wife's business entities." You explicitly walled yourself off from Sienna's money, Julian. You legally protected her company from your own debt. You cannot touch a single cent of her corporate funds to save this property or your parents' home. Pastor Calvin let out a loud, agonizing groan and collapsed into a folding chair. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly. Evelyn was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as she looked wildly at the police officers and then back at me. "But we have the house!" Evelyn shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She signed over her house to us in that same agreement. We can sell it. We can sell the downtown commercial properties she gave us to pay off the bank. We are not broke." Elias shook his head, offering Evelyn a look of absolute clinical pity. "You really should have hired a competent lawyer, Evelyn. The agreement promised to transfer the deeds, but it was completely contingent on the assumption of a clean financial title. Because this massive commercial loan was already in default, the state automatically froze all property transfers involving the guarantors. The transfer of Sienna's house was legally void the second the ink dried. You own absolutely nothing." Julian fell to his knees on the grass right there in front of the barbecue grill. The realization of his absolute stupidity had finally crushed him. He had orchestrated his own total ruin because he was too greedy and too arrogant to understand the trap he was walking into. He had traded millions of dollars in corporate protection for a piece of paper that was entirely worthless. Mr. Vance, the bank representative, cleared his throat, demanding the attention of the hysterical family. "There is one final matter regarding the foreclosure," he announced. "As you know, commercial defaults of this magnitude are often sold off to private debt collection firms to expedite the recovery process. The bank held a closed auction yesterday afternoon to offload the toxic debt tied to this church and your primary residence." Julian looked up from the grass, his eyes red and swollen. "Who bought it?" he asked, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization. "Who owns the debt?" I stepped out from behind the table, walking slowly toward my kneeling husband. I looked down at him, feeling completely detached from the man I had once loved. I felt no anger anymore, just a profound sense of closure. "I did, Julian," I said, my voice cold and steady. "My corporate entity purchased the foreclosed debt at a massive discount. I own the commercial lien. I own the deed to your parents' house, and I own the ground you are currently kneeling on." The silence that fell over the congregation was absolute. The church members stared at me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. I had not just defeated their corrupt pastor. I had legally conquered their entire institution. I had bought the battlefield, and now I was the absolute owner of their legacy. Evelyn let out a sharp, terrified wail, dropping her expensive designer bag onto the grass. She finally understood that I held her entire life in the palm of my hand. She was homeless, and her husband was disgraced. Trent had been standing quietly near the edge of the tents, trying his best to blend into the shadows. He saw that the entire empire had collapsed, and he decided it was time to run. He slowly backed away toward the catering vans, hoping the police officers were too distracted by Julian's mental breakdown to notice him. He thought he could just slip away and leave my in-laws to face the consequences of his fraudulent actions. But I noticed him, and so did Mr. Vance. "Officer," Mr. Vance called out, pointing directly at Trent. "That is the primary guarantor right there." Two heavy-set police officers immediately broke away from the group and sprinted toward the catering vans. Trent panicked and tried to run, but he was wearing expensive leather dress shoes on slippery, wet grass. He tripped over a heavy electrical cord connected to the jazz band's speakers. He crashed hard onto the concrete pathway, scraping his hands and knees. Before he could even try to get back up, the officers were on him, pushing his face against the cold pavement. "What are you doing?" Trent screamed as the officers roughly pulled his arms behind his back. I did not do anything. The loan was Julian's idea. He made me sign it. He told me it was free money. Mr. Vance walked over to Trent, looking down at him with absolute professional disgust. "During the foreclosure audit, the bank thoroughly reviewed the original loan application you submitted 3 years ago," he explained loudly so the entire crowd could hear. "We discovered that you heavily falsified your limited liability company's income statements and forged tax documents to secure the initial approval. Furthermore, you routed those funds across state lines to offshore gambling syndicates, which violates multiple banking regulations." Layla screamed, covering her mouth in horror, as the reality of her husband's actions finally caught up to them. She dropped her colorful cocktail onto the grass, sobbing uncontrollably. "You are being placed under arrest for felony mortgage fraud and federal wire fraud," the lead officer stated firmly, ignoring Trent's pathetic struggling. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it right now." The crowd watched in absolute stunned silence as the police handcuffed Trent for mortgage and wire fraud. The flashing lights of the police cruisers painted the white event tents in alternating shades of red and blue. The officers pulled Trent to his feet, his expensive suit now stained with wet mud and grass. They walked him aggressively toward the back of the cruiser, pushing his head down as they shoved him into the back seat. Layla was screaming uncontrollably, running after the car, but another officer held her back, warning her that she would be arrested for obstruction if she did not step away. The heavy door of the police car slammed shut, sealing Trent's fate and cementing the absolute ruin of my husband's family. The church congregation did not wait around to offer their sympathies. The elders who had just been drinking expensive whiskey with Julian turned their backs and began walking toward their cars in absolute disgust. Deacon Washington shook his head, muttering about false prophets and the wrath of God as he led the rest of the board off the property. The catering staff quietly began packing up the silver trays of food, eager to distance themselves from the active crime scene. The extravagant barbecue that was supposed to celebrate their ultimate triumph had transformed into the stage for their total and complete public execution. Evelyn watched her high society friends walk away without looking back. She realized in that exact moment that her social currency was completely bankrupt. Her name was ruined, and her wealth was a complete illusion. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail and collapsed onto the manicured grass. She fell hard, her knees buckling beneath her. Her brand-new designer dress was immediately soaked with mud, but she did not even care. She reached out toward Pastor Calvin, looking for comfort, looking for a husband to protect her from the consequences of her own greed. But Calvin just looked down at her with a hollow, empty expression. He turned away from the woman who had secretly drained his congregation and slowly walked down the driveway alone, a broken pastor without a church, without a home, and without a legacy. Julian was the only one left. He was still kneeling on the grass, watching the absolute destruction of his entire universe unfold in real time. He looked at the police cars driving away with his brother-in-law. He looked at his mother sobbing in the dirt. And finally, he slowly turned his tear-streaked face toward me. He tried to stand up, but his legs were shaking too much. He crawled toward me on his hands and knees, closing the distance between us like a wounded animal. His face was a mask of sheer pathetic desperation. The arrogant man who had demanded my money and stolen my peace of mind was completely gone. "Sienna, please." Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Sienna, you cannot do this to me. I am your husband. I am the man you stood at the altar with and promised to love in sickness and in health. Please do not walk away from me. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. Trent manipulated me. My mother pressured me. I never wanted to hurt you, Sienna. I was just trying to keep my family together. Please let us go home. Let us go back to our house and talk about this. I will do whatever you want. I will go to counseling. I will get a real job. Just please do not leave me out here with nothing." He reached out, trying to grab the hem of my tailored black suit pants. I took a deliberate step backward, ensuring his dirty hands grasped nothing but empty air. I looked down at him, feeling completely empty. There was no anger left in my heart. There was no sadness. There was only a cold, absolute certainty that I was looking at a parasite that had finally been detached from its host. "You do not have a home, Julian," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "You signed the post-nuptial agreement. You waived your rights to my corporate assets. You legally separated yourself from my wealth. And because you did that, the bank took this land and your parents' house. You have absolutely nothing left to your name." I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against a small round piece of metal I had placed there earlier that morning. It was a single silver quarter. I pulled it out and held it between my thumb and index finger, feeling the cold ridges along the edge. Julian stared at my hand, his eyes wide and panicked, waiting for a lifeline, waiting for me to pull out a checkbook or a credit card like I always used to do. He was still hoping that the quiet, submissive wife he had exploited for years was hiding somewhere beneath my cold exterior. I flicked my wrist and tossed the 25-cent coin directly at him. It bounced off his chest and landed in the wet grass near his knees. "Go find a payphone, Julian," I commanded, my voice echoing with finality across the empty lawn. "You have exactly 2 hours to vacate my property." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on the man who had abandoned me in a hospital room. I walked alongside Elias down the long concrete driveway, leaving the chaotic scene behind me. I did not look back at Evelyn sobbing on the ground. I did not look back at the white event tents. I just kept walking toward the black luxury vehicle waiting for me at the curb. Elias opened the back door for me and I slid onto the soft leather seat. The engine purred to life, and the driver pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the church and my toxic past in the rearview mirror. As we drove through the quiet suburban streets, I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The titanium rod in my spine ached slightly, but it felt like a badge of honor. It was a physical reminder of the breaking point that had finally forced me to rebuild my life. I had survived a devastating car crash, but more importantly, I had survived the family that tried to feast on my wreckage. The healing process would be long. There would be days of physical therapy and moments of lingering betrayal. But the heaviest weight had been permanently lifted from my shoulders. I had reclaimed my empire, my wealth, and my absolute independence. I had learned the hard way that loyalty is a dangerous weapon when it is placed in the hands of greedy, entitled people. But I had also learned my own immense power. Sometimes the only way to cure a systemic infection is to cut out the parasites completely and without mercy. Have you ever had to sever ties with a family member who viewed your success as their personal bank account? How did you find the strength to finally close the vault? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving toxic relationships and taking back your power. Share this video with someone who might be struggling to set boundaries with manipulative people. Remind them that it is okay to walk away, and that the best revenge is always building a life they can no longer afford to touch. Thank you for listening, and remember that your peace of mind is the one asset you should never allow anyone to compromise.